Hey guys, so Internet Mexican here, and just want to talk about something real quick. So let me just start off by saying that I'm under no delusion that I'm a big YouTuber, or that my videos have reach of any kind. Um, and given this fact, I understand that this video will not reach a wide audience, but I hope it at least reaches its intended target. The intended target being a YouTube channel known as The Lodge, but probably better known as Arch Warhammer. Now, some of you may have even heard of Arch Warhammer, and for my friends who may be seeing this video on YouTube, or on Facebook actually, it is going on YouTube, but who may have seen it on Facebook, you've probably actually heard of Arch Warhammer for me. See, I've been watching Arch Warhammer now for about a year due to his Warhammer content, seeing as how I'm actually a pretty big Warhammer 40,000 fan. And he does have some excellent videos explaining the lore. And he explains it in such a way where it doesn't seem like he's just reading it off of Wikipedia or something. So when it comes to like Warhammer lore videos, he's clearly one of the better sources. He's also gone into making other videos where he rants about politics and current events and such, and it's one of these videos that I'm going to be commenting on, specifically the video where he speaks about deferred action for childhood arrivals and the Dream Act. Now, this, I feel, is something that perhaps he doesn't have a lot of experience with or a lot of knowledge about, and I would like to comment on some of the things that he said. I wish to point out that I will be commenting as someone who has grown up in the United States, who lives in the United States currently, and who himself is a DACA recipient, or a so-called dreamer, as opposed to an outsider who appears to have done some quick Google search research, but still managed to get some of the basic concepts wrong. So first, let's talk about the Dream Act. Now, the Dream Act was first introduced August 2001 and has had several revisions since then, none of which have passed, but have, I think, at least come close to passing. Now, according to Arch, the act would lead to undocumented people who have entered the United States before the age of 16, if they meet certain prerequisites, to be granted full citizenship. Now, as a person who was eagerly awaiting for the passing of this act and was thoroughly crushed when the act was defeated, I can tell you that it's bullshit. The act did not grant immediate citizenship to any undocumented person. In fact, the act granted a path towards citizenship, which would be implemented in a series of steps and only if certain prerequisites were met. The ages which qualified for the Dream Act varied across the variations of the act, from 2001 to 2012, but in no case was immediate citizenship granted, but rather those who qualified were granted conditional residency if they met prerequisites, and legal permanent residency if they met further sets of prerequisites. Now, I'm not sure. See, I'm sure that Arch maybe made a simple mistake in explaining the Dream Act, or at least I'm hoping it was a mistake when he was explaining it, rather than him trying to build some sort of false narrative of the Dream Act or DACA being some sort of amnesty, because it's not. Since you failed, though, to accurately portray what the Dream Act was, and that it actually created two forms of residency, you also failed in mentioning the last set of prerequisites that would lead to the legal permanent residency status. The prerequisites you did mention would actually only apply for conditional residency, which if not met would actually lead to deportation. Because again, the conditions were for conditional residency and not citizenship. Permanent residency would only be granted if these following prerequisites were met within 6 years of meeting the first prerequisites, and these were the ones that you left out either on purpose or by accident. Now, the prerequisites are attend an institution of higher education for at least 2 years or have served in the United States military. And if you served in the military and were discharged, it had to have been an honorable discharge. You also had to be subject to more background checks and be of good moral character. Good moral character possibly being gauged by not having any criminal record of any kind other than your undocumented status. It should be noted that many military leaders at the time saw this as a positive because it would boost recruitment in a time when there was supposedly a recruitment crisis. However, issues with recruitment were later fixed during the economic crisis when people were often faced with no other employment options other than joining the military. Let's not forget, though, that another program existed at the same time by which non-citizen immigrants could serve in the military and earn permanent residency or citizenship. This program was known as MAVNI. However, it's not really related to DACA or deferred action, but it existed. I myself was okay with the conditions for the DREAM Act, and I met them all. I met them all perfectly. At the time I was attending university, I was in my 4th year, and I wanted to serve in the United States Marine Corps, having actually taken the ASVABs twice, thinking that maybe I could qualify for MAVNI. You are right, though. DACA did grant many of the benefits which the DREAM Act would grant, but it sure as hell didn't grant all of them. However, what you fail to mention is that the states had a lot of control as to how DACA would be implemented, with some states granting more rights to Dreamers than others. For instance, in the state of California, I was allowed to get a driver's license, work, get financial aid, get a social security number. I immediately took advantage of the driver's license and the ability to find a legitimate job, because finding a legitimate, not under-the-table job would make it easier to pay taxes. It's harder I still paid taxes when I didn't have DACA, but it was harder, due to not having a W-2. It wasn't impossible, though. It also meant that I could use the degree that I earned and the knowledge that I had obtained instead of working jobs that made absolutely no use of my education. To be 100% clear, state benefits differed state to state and were not uniform all around. For instance, I think Arizona, one of the most anti-illegal immigrant states in the country, I believe did not allow DACA recipients to get a license, a driver's license, or an ID. And it varied from different states. Obviously, I live in California, so I did get a license. I was able to get a job, and I was able to apply for financial aid, which I never did because, I was handling it on my own. There was no need for it. Also, one of the biggest benefits of DACA was that people like me, who have assimilated, gotten educated, and have something to contribute, could actually come out of the shadows and be fully contributing members of society, instead of a generation stuck working menial jobs, not making full use of the skills we learned or the education we had obtained. It was our chance to show the nation why we deserved a chance to prove that we could earn citizenship if a path towards legalization was made available. Also, a quick note, because you mentioned Obama's executive orders. Obama's use of executive orders is in no way an indication that he was totalitarian or dictatorial. The use of executive orders was necessary in his administration, especially when dealing with a Congress that made it a point to not allow a Democratic president to pass legislation based solely on the fact that he is a Democrat. And they were Republican. It was a sign of them working for their party rather than working for the country. Executive orders were needed in order to allow the country to keep moving forward instead of coming to a standstill due to a combative, uncooperative Congress that was hell-bent on sabotaging the president simply because he wasn't a member of their party. So you're right, executive orders should be issued in cases of emergencies or when Congress moves too slowly, but also in times when Congress is in the act of sabotage due to bullshit party politics. But back to the point. I would also like to touch on the fact that I agree that data on illegal immigration and its economic effects and overall effects on the country seem to be skewed depending on who you are asking, due to so many groups having their own agenda they wish to push forward. For this reason, it's kind of hard to truly gauge the actual costs and benefits that any immigrant group might have on the country, although there are a lot of think tanks trying to push their own agenda. However, let's talk about some other things you mentioned. Specifically when you talked about the different categories of immigrants that were categorized in Europe and your attempt at applying this immigration, scale in the United States, specifically to immigrants from Mexico, which came to the United States of America, and the cultural differences. For one, your point that a legal immigrant can be more integrated than an illegal appears to be a fair point at first glance, but it's making the assumption that simply because one immigrant is here illegally, where the other is here illegally, that the legal immigrant will somehow be more integrated. The process of entering the United States really doesn't have much to do with how integrated you are to American culture, but really more of whether or not you have the money to pay for the process, or whether or not you have met all legal prerequisites. It's just as likely that an illegal immigrant that lives in the USA can be much more integrated than someone who moved here legally. Legal status is in no way an indication of education level or level of integration, somehow something which is actually heavily implied by your comment, either purposefully or otherwise. Well, what I would like to understand is where you obtain the ability to read minds of illegal immigrants when you make the accusation that illegal immigrants that pay taxes are not doing it out of any sort of sense of civil responsibility, but rather because they have the ulterior motive of trying to obtain a leniency from an immigration court should they be captured and prosecuted. I want to know how you have the confidence to make that statement, because it is solely based on an assumption you seem to have made based on your own ideological bias on the subject. You make a claim that, 50% of illegals pay taxes, but fail to mention any of the reasons as to why the number could be so low, other than they're illegal, because there are various factors and various reasons which could apply. To me, you were simply jumping to conclusions. Because I have paid my taxes. I've paid my taxes for as long as I've been working. My father, my mother, other family members, they've all paid their taxes for as long as they've been working. Whether they've been working, for as long as they even worked here illegally whenever they did. We do it not out of any sort of fear of being caught, but the reason we do it is because to us it is our civil responsibility. It's our way of contributing to the country and the community which we have chosen to be a part of. We understand that it's our responsibility, a responsibility that apparently isn't shared by our president, Donald Trump, as he has claimed in the past that not paying taxes makes him smart. Oh, and by the way, these comments are not coming based on my feelings as you would, as you suggested in your video, that people who share similar feelings to mine are basing their comments based on their feelings. Rather, I'm basing it off my experience. Your sentiment that somehow granting residency to Dreamers would be a bigger drain on the economy is also, frankly, ridiculous, because that would be what would be happening here is we would be creating a path for the creation of more permanent taxpayers, simply because Dreamers would continue to work the jobs that they've acquired since they've acquired DACA, and we would have access to higher paying jobs, which would allow us to make use of the skills and education which we've obtained. After all, the vast majority of Dreamers, which again, I think you failed to mention this, are people which have been in this country since childhood. They've been educated in American schools, they've assimilated to American culture, and they've attended American universities. By all accounts, these people are Americans in every shape or form except on paper. You don't seem to grasp this, and you don't seem to grasp that the issue of immigration, of these Dreamers, of DACA, is not black and white. Now, I also want to make a comment on your proposal. See, you said yourself in that video that you want to open, or you would support opening a path towards citizenship for some Dreamers. And your proposal was that these people have to speak English, which I agree 100% with, because I feel that assimilation is important. If you're going to be a part of a community, you should be able to communicate with other members of that community, right? Makes sense. You also mentioned education, which, again, was a part of the DREAM Act. You had to be attending an institute of higher education. You have to have, at minimum, a high school education in the United States. You have to be employed, which, by the way, DACA has been around for 5 years now. Believe me, 800,000 to 900,000 of us have DACA. We've been employed, bro. So we would meet that requirement. But the part that really cracked me up was when you said these people would have to be productive members. As productive as you can be with an immigrant background, which, by the way, wow, what a fucking bigoted ass comment. Implying that someone with an immigrant background would somehow be less productive, especially when we're talking about dreamers. Where a huge part of wanting to legalize dreamers is that this group of immigrants have already been assimilated. That statement was, in my opinion, was just fucking idiotic. I want you to understand this, though. Through that video, you were critical of deferred action for childhood arrivals and the DREAM Act, which grants some level of legitimacy to dreamers based on the meeting of prerequisites. But then you suggest a system by which legitimacy would be granted to a select few who meet a certain series of prerequisites. In other words, you went from criticizing DACA and the DREAM Act to literally proposing a system like DACA and the DREAM Act. So I don't think that you thought that through very well. And I would just like to end on this point, Arch. I don't think you fully understand the subject matter that you decided to comment on. It's obvious that you're commenting as an outsider that hasn't been affected by deferred action for childhood arrivals or the DREAM Act. And although I respect your right to have an opinion and I respect your right to free speech and to talk about this, I would also suggest that you stick to what you know. I love your Warhammer content. Perhaps you'd be better suited if you stayed in your lane. This has been Internet Mexican. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Internet Mexican or on Twitter at Internet Mexican. Thanks for watching.